community knows what they need. They really, really do. Just because we're suffering, with all of the bad stuff, like, because to me, that's systems effects, it doesn't mean that we don't know what we need. Systems aren't designed for what we need, and we are very often not involved in the design of those systems. Yes, well, there's like many of us, I do wear many hats, but I always start with letting people know my personal background. And so I am Anishinaabe. I am from a place called Skownan First Nation, which is my mother's nation. She was physically born there. It's in an area of Treaty 2 in Manitoba, Canada. So we're sort of right in the middle of the province, is where in an area well known for its lakes. It's called the Interlake region. So yeah, so I was, been born in my family, raised in my family, raised by lots of Anishinaabe. My dad was Métis. He's passed away now. Yeah, and just had a really, loving upbringing in my family. I then came to Winnipeg to go to school, to go to university, and right out of university, ended up moving in, coming into the north end of Winnipeg, the inner city of Winnipeg, where I just met the most wonderful, sophisticated leaders that I knew almost immediately that I wanted to work with them, and everything they were doing resonated for me. And yeah, like I've been there ever since. So my whole career has been working in the inner city and working with, Indigenous organizations that are led by Indigenous leaders, governed, at the governance level. The programming is all from an Indigenous perspective, serving primarily Indigenous families. Of course, the work we do actually is really good for all families, but primarily Indigenous families have come through the doors of the organizations I've been a part of. And definitely the programming has been from an Indigenous perspective, an Indigenous worldview, value base. And yeah, just very proud to say that I've been led by matriarchs my whole life, being born into a family of matriarchs and then just working with them right up till now. I'm still surrounded by very, very wise matriarchs to this day. So I'm very privileged. I'm very, yeah, humbled and privileged. Well, as I said, I really learned so much from the matriarchs my whole life and particularly in my professional career. And, they really taught me so much about the work that we need to do in our communities to really, have healthy and thriving communities. And they've always, said it's mostly systems that are kind of getting in the way of families. It's not so much about individual capacity. I mean, there's some of that, and we do provide some support for that, but really it's about getting the systems out of the way. So I do come into I think I'm in my governance era now. I sit on a lot of boards, and I bring that systems thinking into the boardroom and into the decision making. But in addition to that, I have heard once before, which really resonated with me, is that if you change who is in the conversation changes. And so that has always that landed with me, and that has always stuck with me. So every time I go into any situation, I'm looking around the room to see who's in the room, see who's in the circle. And if there isn't enough, diverse voices, then I make it my point of trying to bring other voices into those circles, and particularly the voices that aren't typically invited into those circles. I'm always, working real hard to try and make room for more and bring in more along. But on a personal level, I absolutely bring that Indigenous worldview, that Indigenous value base, that those Indigenous knowledge systems definitely have come from an Indigenous experience, being a First Nations woman in this country, and just yeah, being treated that way, being treated as a citizen like that, sometimes a second-class citizen. But to really leaning into those Indigenous knowledge systems in those decision-making circles. For instance, I really lean on clan system teachings, which really center the concept of consensus and collaboration, which is, a little bit different than sometimes the, Robert's rules or so there's a lot of the Western paradigm, which I'm surrounded by in all of these places, have something to offer. And then there's other paradigms. And so I think like clan system teachings might be a little bit different than the Roberts rules and the majority vote and things like that. Like consensus is very different, right? And when you think about in your own family, if one of your family members disagrees, I don't think you just go, oh, majority rules, we move on. I think you really try to understand why does that family member feel that way and how might we, meet their needs. And so you don't just leave them behind. I think of medicine wheel teachings that really center relationship. They center, how might we look to the interconnectedness versus independence? Like, how are we interconnected? How does that relate to the whole? And rather than sort of breaking it all down to its smallest denominator, no, can we see the whole? Like, that's complexity, right? How can we see the whole and how might we make decisions with that holistic view? I think about all my relations teachings that are not even human centric. Like we don't even privilege human beings when we're talking about all my relations. It's about how are we in that really good relationship with all our relatives, which is animals, water, the land. We talk in very familial terms with like our cousins and Mother Earth. And so like we are a big family. And so we have to be really concerned about the health and wellness of the whole family, not just ourselves. Um, I always lean into concepts of like what's a mutuality of interest versus a conflict of interest. How might we bring, approaches of emergence and iteration in addition to that strategic planning? How might we bring, intuitive kinds of thinking, in addition to logic-based thinking? How might we think about values-based decision making, which is different than, say, rule-based decision making? So, yeah, so I bring all of those types of approaches into the conversations. And sometimes, if you're not used to thinking in those ways or operating in those ways, it feels very different. And then you have to figure out how might we have these conversations that might take into consideration what feels like a different approach or a viewpoint. Well, bimaadiziwin, I think all of us probably know what that concept is, and I think all of us are probably trying to live it. And it's just living our best lives. It's about living in balance, right? It's about having enough. It's about, living with an abundance mindset, not a scarcity mindset. We have lots of knowledge, teachings in the Anishinaabe world. And so living, the seven teachings, which are love, honesty, courage, truth, wisdom, respect, humility. When you really lean into those teachings, and if you can live, in those ways, like it's a very beautiful life. And so I do think our families are trying their very best to live their mino bimaadiziwin. I think systems interrupt and get in the way of that. But if we really listen to what families are asking for, um, like it's not I always say it's not rocket science. It's actually not that complex. Families are asking usually for some fairly basic things for themselves and their children. And but the systems just can't seem to deliver it. And so that's where we're always so focused in on systems change. But on the data and data points and all that stuff, I just go to I'm trying very hard. I do believe in leaning into equity. And so I do think we have some heavy lifting to do for, when we lean into equity. So for sure that. But I also think there's room for all of us, right? And so I try, and I have to always correct myself. I try not to think about the either or. I try to live in the and, like it's this, and this. But I always have to, again, really make sure that I remind myself that. But when it comes to the data stuff, I think about, well, who needs what kind of evidence? Like different audiences need different evidences, right? And so when we take our family, say, into ceremony or into sweat lodge, when we come out of that sweat lodge, like people just treat each other very differently. They treat like now we've been in ceremony, right? And now like we just treat each other with that love and that kindness and like we just treat each other better. And we see that with each other Like I just experience it and I take that as evidence that ceremony is a good thing. Now, how do you start putting that into quantifications or stuff? It's different, right? But I do think right now that the sort of Western sort of paradigm, um, that a lot of that is the data that gets collected and shaped is really based on measuring our weaknesses. And we're always pushing for how might we create indicators and data collection that actually counts our strengths, like and starts to document and starts to show where we're strong. Because you can't build healthy communities based off the weaknesses. The weaknesses are there, we can't ignore them. And we need to start documenting where the strengths are. And that's where we need to build our mino bimaadiziwin. That's where we need to build our healthy communities. I think a lot about, and so it's very rare that we get to shape the data, that we get to shape what's getting collected, that we get to shape how it gets analyzed, how it gets stored, even sitting with our own raw data. Like we don't get to do that. Somebody else is usually shaping all of that for us. I'm talking about as Indigenous people. And so there's lots of work being done around data sovereignty. And I know my friends, my fellow Thunderbirds over at Animikii are really thinking about like, what does data sovereignty mean and how do we then deliver that for our communities? And so I encourage everyone to take a look at Animikii. I think there's all kinds of ways to express that evidence. I think Anishinaabe, we're very oral. We love storytelling. I know in some of the Western sort of harder types of research that feels like it's anecdotal, but in the end, I just want to know from our families, did this matter to you? The data can say a lot of things, but what really sways me is when families say it. So I want to hear right from them. I want to hear their stories. I want to hear their affirmations. Like I just want to hear what they have to say. So we need to start creating sort of spaces and tools to allow for that voice to come through. Because for me, and then pair it with that, quantification and that other kind of data that is already out there. But fundamentally, I think if our families could be listened to in terms of what do they want measured, what matters to them, like, and then how do we go about collecting that data? Even how we collect the data is super important. So, yeah, so that's some of the thoughts that we're always working with at Boldness and trying to find new tools and trying to implement and try to hold up to the rest of the world and say, this is a way that might work for us. Yeah, well, again, I do feel like a lot of those systems are built with that sort of scarcity mindset. They're built with this, yeah, they're not built to promote health and wellness and thriving. And so then our families end up having to survive the system. If you can get through the gauntlet or if you can get through the system, that's then we have resilience for having been through that. But that's just not, I don't think, the kind of world we want to build. And so I know at Boldness as a lab, we're always trying to figure out how to build prototypes. And so we've really had to think about we innovate to survive, and certainly we are doing some of that. But more so, we want to innovate to thrive. And so when we ask our families, what do you think the problem is? Sometimes they define it so very differently than how other people looking from the outside might define it. So we got to start there. And if that's what they think the problem is, then we ask them, well, what do you think the solution is? And they'll tell you, like our community is very wise. They know what works and what doesn't work for them. Obviously, they're the experts in their own lives. And then if we say to them, okay, well, if you could, you know, design a solution, what would it start to look like? And our families almost naturally go to the thrive because they're thinking about their kids. And so, one of the prototypes we worked on was, the infant mortality issue, which is a very, very serious issue. And there is a solution out there called the baby box, which was about, a safe sleep surface for your baby. So it kept your baby alive. And when we went to our community with that, our community said, well, that's a low bar. We don't want just to keep our babies alive. We want our babies to thrive. And so if you define the problem as keeping your baby alive or creating, solutions for your baby to thrive, it's a whole different solution finding. Like the starting place is different. And then therefore the solution that comes out of that is very, very different. And it's just way more robust, way more holistic, way more interconnected with, whole all communities around baby versus sort of here's a box for your baby to sleep in as a safe sleep surface. So our community almost always just goes to thrive all the time. And so, but it does require like being able to hold for that holistic mindset, which sometimes feels very complex for people. But I do think this is like interesting times in this world, and the leaders of today and tomorrow really need to be super skilled at holding for complexity, right? And so I do think Indigenous worldviews really set us up to just naturally think in that holistic way and naturally lean into those complex conversations in a more natural way. I think that, and again, I just want to keep reiterating that when we think about innovating to survive or innovating to thrive, that it really is based on strengths. And so families naturally will say, yeah, we think we need to do this, this, and this, which builds their strengths, not necessarily, a solution that immediately addresses the weakness. The weakness gets taken care of when the strength becomes stronger, right? Like it eventually happens, but that's just not where we start. I mean, I'm Indigenous through and through and through, so I can't not be me. So I do think that I always, my indigeneity always leads me, and I can't, just put it aside. So I'll say that, and I try there when I was younger, when I started really learning about the systemic nature of racism and colonization and all the bad things that have been done to Indigenous people and in fact, lots of people around the world. I there was a lot of anger, and so there was a lot of fight in me. There was a lot of yeah, just standing with my fist in the air. I'm a little bit older now, and I've mellowed a little bit, and I've learned that this idea that we can coexist. If I can just really work really hard to understand where you're coming from, I don't need to convert you. Like I'm not out to convert anybody. But I really do want to understand you. And if you and I have a fundamental difference, I want to understand why. And I do think that, when we're able to live in a world that can embrace that kind of diversity, like we can still stand each other up, even though we fundamentally disagree on something. Like it's okay if you think differently on this than I do. It's okay. And so, I learned this word like polyolithic thinking versus monolithic thinking. Like there can be many and all there's room for all. And that's the clan systems teachings, that there's room for everyone and that everyone actually has a role. And so we have to really work hard at our interconnectedness to figure out how do our roles complement each other. They don't have to be the same, right? They can complement each other. And if they differ, there's probably a teaching in that and probably a reason for that. So again, I just go back to really centering relationship. If I care about you, then I care about your opinions. And it's okay if we don't agree, but fundamentally I care about you. And so I don't get into debates with you necessarily. I mean, we can explore all the issues together, but I just don't feel like I need to overtake you or I don't need to convert you. Like we can just hold for multiple viewpoints. It's okay. And we need those multiple viewpoints, really. When you look at Mother Nature and you look around, like there's a lot of diversity and it's all great and it's all beautiful. Well, I just always keep saying over and over again, community knows what they need. They really, really do. Just because we're suffering, with all of the bad stuff, like, because to me that's systems effects, it doesn't mean that we don't know what we need. Systems aren't designed for what we need, and we are very often not involved in the design of those systems and therefore creating those really negative outcomes. So if you can find ways to, again, you can fund this, you can structure this into your programming, like It's intentional and it requires dedicated sort of thought and resources to center relationality. So build in ways to listen, like really listen to community and try to really, when they say they need something, believe them. And when they, and when they ask for the things, like try really hard to provide what they're asking for, because most of our systems aren't set up to actually deliver what families are asking for, which again sounds so silly when you say it out loud, but that is the truth. So really trying hard to deliver what community needs. And so then in innovation world, we talk about co-creation. Like, don't be Superman. I know you have great ideas. However, you have to go listen to the people, and you're not there to save them. Nobody needs you to save them. But you are an ally and there's a role for you. And so you have influence and you have power and you have something you can bring to the solution. Just really try to understand where your solution or where your role fits. It might not, so yeah, so just be really thoughtful and intentional. And I feel like when you're in good relationship with people, the relationship guides you, right? The relationship tells you when you're kind of off track, and the relationship tells you when you're on track. And the relationship will, kind of kick you in the butt a little bit when you're not doing right. But it will also hold you tight and wipe your tears and stand you up again when you've messed up, right? So yeah, so those are sort of my final thoughts. Just it sounds simple and it can be. It doesn't have to be complicated.